Hi, have a great day, everyone. By the way, I am Beverly Tavius together with my partner Kay Traya. So, we will be the one to discuss to you about the nervous system. So, I know that we already learned about the endocrine system, which, as we compared it from our nervous system, so endocrine system is more on the hormones, while nervous system is that neurons are the basic functional unit of this system. So, now let's talk about more about this topic.
So what is nervous system? Nervous system is the master controlling and communicating system of our body. So it is the one that controls and coordinates all essential functions in our human body. Also, our nervous system has several functions. First, it functions as a monitoring changes. So it uses millions of sensory receptors to monitor changes. So it monitors changes of what would occur both inside and outside our body. Second one, it functions as an interpretation of sensory input. So it processes and interprets the sensory input and decides what should be done at each moment. And third one, effects of responses. So it then affects our response by activating muscles or glands via motor output, and it functions as a mental activity, which the brain is the center of mental activity, including here is the consciousness, our thinking, and memory. And the fourth one is that our nervous system functions as a homeostasis, so it can help stimulate or inhibit the activities of other systems to help maintain a constant internal environment. So this is now the anatomy of our nervous system, which our nervous system is divided into two, which is our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system. Our central nervous system is where our brain and spinal cord, which is responsible for integrating and processing and coordinating sensory data and motor command. While peripheral nervous system, this includes now all our neural tissues outside our central nervous system, including now our different sensory receptors. When it comes to the organization of the nervous system, we have its structural classification, which has two subdivisions, the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, as what I've said earlier. The CNS or our central nervous system that consists of our brain and spinal cord, it occupies the dorsal body cavity and acts as an integrating and command center of our nervous system. And our peripheral nervous system is the part of the nervous system that outside our central nervous system that consists mainly of the nerves that extend from brain and spinal cord. We also have our two types of cells that make up our nervous system. First is the neurons, then the glial cells. Our neurons is also called as nerve cells. It is a highly specialized that used to transmit messages from one part of our body to another. While our glial cells, this is our supportive cells of our CNS and our PNS, which enhance our neuron function and maintain normal conditions within our nervous tissue. As you could see in our image, we have now the structure of our neuron. So our neuron, it has different parts. Examples of this, we have the cell body, the metabolic center of the neuron, the dendrites that receive signals from other cells, the nucleus which controls the entire neuron, and the axon that transfers signals to other cell and organs, axon hillock, the conical projection that connects the cell body of the neuron with the axon of the neuron, and the axon terminals is part of the axon that releases the neurotransmitters that relay signals across a synapse. We also have the synaptic lift. So each axon terminal is separated from the next neuron by a tiny gap called the synaptic lift. And the myelin sheaths, most long nerve fibers are covered with a whitish fatty material called the myelin. So we also have the nodes of Ranvier. So because of the myelin sheath is formed by many individual Schwann cells, it has a gap, so or indention, so called the nodes of Ranvier. So that's indentions or gaps is called now our nodes of Ranvier, and our Schwann cells is produces the myelin sheaths. We also have now the structure of our glial cells, or also called as neuroglia. So we have different types of glial cells present in our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system. In our central nervous system, we have the ependymal cells, the astrocytes, the oligodendrocytes, and the microglia. While in the peripheral nervous system, we have the satellite cells and the Schwann cells. So our oligodendrocytes and the Schwann cells, it functions as the cells that trap axons in myelin sheaths that increase action potential velocity. So it is present in our central nervous system, which one cell branches to wrap around multiple axons, while in the peripheral nervous system, we have the Schwann cells that one cell wraps around one axon segment only. So in our astrocytes, satellite cells, and ependymal cells is functions as the cells that form borders between nervous tissues and other body tissues or serve as a protection. So the astrocytes and our ependymal cells is the one that makes our central nervous system. It is present in our central nervous system. While our microglia cells, it functions as an immune cells that clear cellular debris from nervous tissues. So it is also present only in our central nervous system. Now let's have the central nervous system or our body's processing center. This consists of our brain and the spinal cord that act as the integrating and command centers of the nervous system, or as referred to as the central, because it combines information from the entire body and coordinates activity across the whole organism. So our central nervous system interpret incoming sensory information and issues instructions based on past experience and current conditions. Now, first, let's talk about the brain, which is under our central nervous system. So, the brain is located within the cranial cavity of the skull. So, our brain, this is the largest and most complex mass of nervous tissue in our body, which also composed of four major regions, which is the cerebral hemispheres, diencephalon, brainstem, and the cerebellum. Let's have now the cerebral hemispheres. So our cerebral hemispheres, it is paired. So it has the left and right cerebral hemispheres, or this is also collectively called as the cerebrum. So this is the most superior part of our brain, our cerebral hemispheres. That even if we put together those other three brain regions combined, still the cerebral hemispheres are the most largest among those three. So our cerebral hemispheres, as you could see in our image, this in our image, that surface of our brain is called our cerebral cortex, and that entire surface of the cerebral hemispheres, it exhibits elevated reaches of tissues. So that elevated reaches of tissues is called now our gyri, and it was been separated by that shallow grooves called now our sulci. So our gyri and our sulci. So we also have the fissures. So that fissures is the less numerous are the deeper grooves of tissues, so which separate large regions of the brain. The cerebral hemispheres are separated by a single deep fissures, which is the longitudinal fissures. We also have the lobes. So other fissures or sulci divide each hemispheres into a number of lobes named for the cranial bones that is lie over them. So our cerebral hemispheres, this functions towards our logical reasoning, moral conduct, emotional responses, sensory interpretation, and the initiation of voluntary muscle activity. We also have the different regions of cerebral hemisphere, which is the superficial cortex of gray matter, internal white matter, and the basal nuclei. So our cerebral hemispheres have different parts also, which we have the cerebral cortex, which is responsible for the speech, memory, logical, and emotional response, as well as the consciousness, interpretation of sensation, and voluntary movement are all functions of our neurons of the cerebral cortex. And another one, we have the parietal lobe. So our parietal lobe, this is the primary somatic sensory area, which is responsible for integrating sensory information, including the touch, the temperature, the pressure, and the pain. While in the occipital lobe, this is the visual area. So in our occipital lobe, this is for our visual perception, including the color, the form, and the motion. In our temporal lobe, this is the auditory area. So the auditory area and with the encoding of the memory. So it also believed to play an important role in processing emotions, language, and certain aspects of visual perception. And lastly is the frontal lobe. So this frontal lobe is for the primary motor area, or it is important for our voluntary movement. It is for the expressive language and for the managing higher level executive functions, which refers to the collection of cognitive skills including the capacity to plan, organize, initiate, self-monitor, and controls one responses. Next, let's have the diencephalon. So the diencephalon or the interbrain, this sits atop the brainstem and is enclosed by the cerebral hemispheres. So this diencephalon has the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the mammillary bodies, and the epithalamus. So the thalamus encloses the shallow third ventricle of the brain, while the hypothalamus plays a role in the regulation of the body temperature, water balance, and the metabolism. While these mammillary bodies, so it relax centers involved in the olfaction, the sense of smell, bulge from the floor of the hypothalamus posterior to the pituitary gland, while the epithalamus, it forms the roof of the third ventricle, which is important parts of the epithalamus are the pineal body, which is part of the endocrine system, and the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, which forms the cerebrospinal fluid. Next, let's have the brainstem. So the brainstem is about the size of a thumb in diameter and approximately 3 inches long. So our brainstem has different structures also. We have the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the reticular formation. So the midbrain is associated with our vision, hearing, motor control, sleep, and wake cycles, alertness, and temperature regulation. While our pons, this contains the nuclei that relay signals from the forebrain to the cerebellum along the nuclei that deals primarily with sleep, respiration, swallowing, bladder control, hearing, equilibrium, taste, eye movement, facial expression, facial sensation, and posture. While our medulla oblongata, this is now the most inferior part of the brainstem because it contains the nuclei that regulate the vital visceral activities, that contains the centers that control our heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, swallowing, and vomiting, and among others. So our reticular formation, this extends the entire length of the brainstem, is a diffuse mass of gray matter. So the reticular formation, the neurons of the reticular formation are involved in motor control of the visceral organs. So we are already done with the cerebrum. So let's proceed to the cerebellum. So this cerebellum is the large cauliflower-like cerebellum projects dorsally from under the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. So its structure, like the cerebellum has two hemispheres and a convoluted surface. It also has an outer cortex made up of gray matter and the inner region of white matter. So its function is to provide precise timing for skeletal muscles activity and controls our balance and equilibrium. So this cerebellum is our responsible for our control balance of our body, and its coverage is that fibers reach the cerebellum from the equilibrium apparatus from the inner ear, the eye, the proprioceptors of the skeletal muscles and tendons, and many other areas. Also, we have these three parts that protects our central nervous system, which are the meninges, the cerebrospinal fluid, and the blood-brain barrier. Which is the meninges, its main function is that it serves as a covering and protection for our central nervous structures, which the meninges has its different parts. While the cerebrospinal fluid, it has a content of less than protein and more vitamin C and glucose. So its function is that the CSF or the cerebrospinal fluid in and around the brain and cord forms a watery cushion that protects the fragile nervous tissue from blows and other trauma. So the CSF forms and drains at a constant rate so that its normal pressure and volume are maintained. Also, this blood-brain barrier, the main function of this is that it shields the brain from toxic substances in the blood, supplies brain tissues with nutrients, and filters harmful compounds from brain back to the bloodstream. That is the main function of our blood-brain barrier, which protects our central nervous system. We are already done with the brain, so now let's proceed to the spinal cord. So the spinal cord has a length approximately 17 inches and 42 centimeters long, which its major function is to provide a two-way conduction pathway to and from the brain, which its location is enclosed within the vertebral column. The spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum of the skull to the first or second lumbar vertebra, where it ends just below the ribs. So this spinal cord is also protected by the meninges, which the meningeal coverings do not end at the second lumbar vertebra but instead extend well beyond the end of the spinal cord in the vertebral canal. So this spinal cord has its spinal nerves, which in humans there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves arise from the cord and exit from the vertebral column to serve the body area close by. And this spinal nerves at the inferior end of the vertebral canal is called the cauda equina because it looks so much like a horse's tail. So inside our spinal cord, we could see in here the gray matter and the white matter, which the one that extends from the brain into the spinal cord that creates a horn-like structure throughout the inside of the spinal cord is what we called our gray matter, as you could see in the image, and the white matter is the one that makes up the surrounding sections of the spinal cord. So that was all about the central nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system would be discussed to you by Kay Traya. Thank you for listening.